Hi, my name's Herbie K, and welcome to the inaugural podcast of Wisdom After the Fall. This podcast is all about commentary with practical advice, and the whole idea being that unlike podcasts that get political and try to, influence your voting or what you believe politically, I'm not interested. We're just going to discuss objective reality. We're going to discuss life as it happens, relationships, business, economy, money, anything really, whatever kind of tickles my fancy. My plan is that every single time I do a show, I'll take a look at the current events and what's going on, and not just the headline stuff, not just the stuff that's on the news and that everyone's talking about, but the stuff that might be a little off the margins that maybe we can all draw a little life lesson from. Because when you've been at the very top and you've gone to the very bottom, your perspective changes. And in my case, at least, it changed for the better. I'm not going to tell you about my background in this particular episode, this inaugural episode. I'm simply going to tell you about what brought me to the bottom, which is the crime that I committed. Or I should say crimes plurally, because there are two counts of the same crime, which was called fraudulent schemes. In 2015, I went to prison for a little over 4 years. I got out in 2019 for those crimes. And that sounds awful, and it was. In total, the restitution that I owe, and I'll never be able to pay back, it's not about money for me at this point, is nearly $10 million. And more than that, I was guilty as sin. Now, fraudulent scheme sounds like something that I planned and that I intended to do from the start, and that much I can tell you is not true. I did what a lot of dummies do, and I was a dummy. I backed into it. It started off honest and became a criminal enterprise. As failure loomed, rather than throw in the towel, I crossed the line, raised money from people I should have never raised money from, exposed them to risks I should have never exposed them to, and in the end, lost all of that money and all of my own money as well. The only positive thing I can say from this, and it's not really positive, is that I lost all my own money too. In fact, I was represented by a public defender and I pled guilty without a trial because I knew I was guilty and I didn't have any money. Although my victims, and let me share with you, understandably so, that the victim of a financial crime will hate the perpetrator worse than the family of a murder victim. And that's not meant to be a joke or be funny. It's just the way it is. And I did leave carnage and havoc behind me in the lives of people, in some cases, that couldn't afford it. There were a total of 35 investors. I'm going to be very specific about this. There were a total of 35 investors for just under $10 million. I think it was 9.7 million, give or take a nickel. And this took place over a period from 1999 until 2012 was the period that the company started. It was a real estate development company in Mexico. The crash of 2008 came. I could go into details and I could explain all the nuts and bolts to it. But the problem is, the minute I start explaining what I did and why I did it and how I did it, it becomes weaseling. You know, if there's one thing that I learned I learned a lot of things in prison, and we'll be sharing those over the episodes. But one of the important things I learned is that criminals always blame everybody but themselves. But if you want to truly seek redemption, at least in my case, I don't think it's necessarily through religion or through forgiving yourself, which I do not do. I have not forgiven myself for what I've done. I'm never going to forgive myself for what I've done. I don't buy into that pop psychology that it all starts with forgiving yourself. I don't think forgiving myself is a good thing. I think I need to feel shame. I think I need to feel pain. I think about the victims of my crime every single day of the week. In fact, there's rarely an hour that goes by that they don't enter my mind. I feel awful about it, and I think I should feel awful about it. Now, I'm not going to tell you that I don't have other things in my life. I'm not going to tell you that I walk through the day with my head hung down and that I'm wallowing in depression. That's just not how I'm wired. And after the next episode, you'll understand why I'm wired the way I am and how I got into doing what I did. Not as an excuse, but to share what I think is maybe a common experience with a lot of you, so that if you are in a similar situation or ever find yourself in a similar situation, you'll recognize it and avoid the trouble and not end up where I ended up at the very, very end. I did it. I did it. Now, in the beginning, I didn't know I was doing it, but there came a point, and let's not bullshit each other. There came a point when I knew I had crossed the line, I simply pushed it out. It's a funny thing about conscience, at least in my experience, is that you can push out of your conscience those things that you don't want to believe that you're guilty of. So I could have, I would have sworn on a stack of Bibles, and I offered to take a polygraph test to the district attorney 100 times. He simply wouldn't give me one. He had his own reasons. I don't know why. But the bottom line is, I think I would have passed the polygraph if I said that I don't think I did anything wrong at that time. But then I had time. What prison isn't like in the movies, and prison isn't, at least not what they show in the movies, the kind of hardcore prisons where, men are raped and things like that. In the 5 years I was in prison, I never saw or heard of a man being raped. And secondly, although it was joked about, but no one ever actually did it, there were plenty of gays in the prison yard, and they were having sex with other gays in the prison yard, but that was just gay men having sex, and they mostly did it in the shower stalls, as I understand. Not that I ever saw them do it, but it was kind of the understanding, which is why I always got into the shower stall first thing in the morning after they cleaned them, because, it was going to get a little weird in there. But anyway, I digressed. By the way, I'm a chronic digressor, and that's how I kind of color up as the story that I'm telling you, to make it more interesting. If that bothers you, I don't know what to tell you. It's just an automatic reaction. I just want to warn you, I'm a chronic digressor. But anyway, prison's not like, everyone walking around and they're horrible and there's blood dripping from their fangs. Now, I knew murderers, and I knew, lots of other guys that committed frauds and robberies and armed robberies and assaults and all kinds of crimes. And I didn't know anybody on death row because I was nowhere near those. Those guys are isolated. The point I'm going to tell you is the real animals are isolated in what are called, at least in Arizona, 5 yards. 5 yards is the highest maximum security yard. And unless you're on the yard, unless you have a good reason for being there yourself, you have nothing to worry about. And I never met any child molesters or rapists because they segregate those guys and they isolate them in their own yards. We used to call them chomo yards, child molester yards. And that's because if any of those men would have ever been put on a regular prison yard, they would have been murdered within a few minutes of getting there. One of the first things that happens when you go to prison is prison is very racially segregated, and not by the state, but by the prisoners themselves. They simply don't want to mix, and they break into racial subgroups. There's the whites, who they call themselves the Woods, which is short for Peckerwood. And why white guys? By the way, the leadership of the whites is the Aryan Brothers and the Skinheads. And I'm Jewish, so you can maybe tell that I didn't really get along too well with those guys, but I knew them. I had to deal with them. I had to deal with their really Hitler-like anti-Semitism. But they didn't attack me, and they threatened me a lot, but I wasn't afraid of them. And if you're not afraid of them, they kind of get bored. It's kind of like the bully syndrome. If you're not going to react to it, if you're just going to tell them basically to, pardon my language, fuck off, they basically fuck off. And that, plus I was protected by another group on the yard, which were the blacks, who were called the kinfolk. Because I was Jewish, I didn't roll with the whites. I rolled with the kinfolk. Roll means affiliate myself with. Because I get along fine with black people, and they get along fine with me, and they protected me in prison, which is what I wanted. And I didn't want to have to pretend that I was a skinhead or even would spend time with filth like that. Then in addition to the whites, the Woods, and the blacks, the kinfolk, and again, they call themselves this. This isn't a pejorative term that I made up. This is what they call themselves. Then there are the Chicanos, which are the American Latinos, and then there are the Paisas, which are the foreign Latinos. Then they segregate because they hate each other. Long story for another podcast when I talk more about prison. And I'll share prison stories with you because some of them are interesting and some of them are funny. And also when I was in prison, I wrote 12 books. It was the most creative period of my life, and I'll get to why that is in just a minute. But while I was in prison, I wrote 12 books, and one of them, which has a working title, 6 Jars of Peanut Butter, are prison stories. And I'll explain that all about that later. And that book will be published a little later on. But, and some of my books I've already published, but in this episode, I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about in the next episode, and the books and how you get them and so on and so forth. By the way, if you want to support this podcast, I suppose I should say this, and because I'm a boomer, obviously, looking at me, let's not pretend otherwise, I really, maybe I'm not the smoothest at starting a YouTube channel. So, the like, subscribe, click, share, that's all great. My Patreon link and Buy Me a Coffee link are below. And my financial goals with this, speaking as a former felon, Well, not a former felon. One of the things you learn about when you have a felony record is every felony is a life sentence. I did 5 years in prison, but I'll be a felon the rest of my life, and that shuts me out. I'll never be able to repay this debt because I'll never earn enough money to repay the debt, and I'll never earn enough money to repay the debt because I'm a felon. And so while the victims of my crime had the satisfaction of putting me away, by doing so, and again, I'd have been on their side. I mean, if I were in their shoes, I'd have felt exactly the same way. This is not a complaint of any kind. But they flushed down any chance of being repaid because I just can't. Plus, I have 2 artificial shoulders, and I lost the bottom lobe of my right lung last year to a lung tumor, which I don't have any tumors. I've been clear ever since, and thank God for good health care. But suffice it to say, I won't be working in any hard way for the rest of my life. I'm 70 years old, and there's just only so much that can be done. Maybe, just maybe, if this podcast were to take off and I were to make a lot of money by some miracle, which is not the goal of the podcast at all, I'll state that in just a second, I would, of course, pay back my victims, and upon my death, anything that I have will go directly to the victims or their surviving families. But realistically, during my lifetime, that's not going to happen, just because I have no ability to earn that kind of money anymore. I did at one time, but that party's over, and the sun has set, and I can't undo the damage that I've done. Even if I did, the damage has long been done. It would just be putting a Band-Aid on a tumor at this point. But anyway, and my goal now, I said I promised I'd tell you this. Yes, I'd like to make a little money from the podcast. What I do now to make ends meet is I live on Social Security, and I drive basically I drive a medical transport for a medical transport service. Again, guys with my felony record can't drive for Uber or Lyft, so I drive for another company that does allow me to do that. Basically, indigent medical patients on Medicaid to and from their medical appointments, or former addicts, lots of which I occasionally meet guys I've been in prison with, lots of whom I take them to methadone. There are a lot of drug addicts in prison. There are a lot of drugs in prison. So this is something we'll talk about in another day. We'll talk about drugs. We'll talk about how to control drugs. We'll talk about prisons. We'll talk about prison reform. We'll talk about what can be done to reduce crime that's actually logical from someone who's not a politician. You know, politicians, left and right, have their heads so far up their asses on crime, it's just unimaginable. And you'd only have to have been in prison. Not that you need to ever go there. I've done it for you. I'll share all this with you, to understand just how stupid our prison system, our law enforcement is, the drug war, how it's carried out, how they do it, so on and so forth. But again, another topic for another day. Today, I just wanted to share with you a little bit of my bad background and just get it out in the open, because there's one thing since I'm never going to run for office, and since I'm not a sociopath, which is what you would have to be a politician. And by the way, I used to think I was a sociopath. When I first went to prison, I spent a lot of hours wondering if I was a sociopath, until finally, later, and when I got out, I went to see a psychiatrist who told me, "You are the furthest thing from a sociopath. You live in constant guilt and pain, and all you do is worry about being a sociopath." And I said, "Why doesn't that make me a sociopath?" And he said, "Because if you were a sociopath, you wouldn't care," which I found a relieving observation, and also made me feel stupid for not realizing that sooner. But I certainly acted in my own self-interest. I certainly acted selfishly. I certainly put my interests and the interests of my family before the interest of anybody else. And these were people, in most cases, who had trusted me for 20 and 30 years in previous businesses where I had treated them and done quite well and made them a lot of money, which counts for nothing, because I took all of that and flushed it down the toilet, much the way I flushed my marriage down the toilet at exactly the same time, which on a personal level I consider worse than the crime. I had it all. I had a beautiful wife. I have 4 children who, thank God, still love me and talk to me and deal with me, but I put them through the ringer. I put my family through the ringer. I put my ex-wife through the ringer, who I don't blame for divorcing me. I deserved it, and not just because of the crime. I was a philanderer. I was a lowlife. I was out of control, and I got exactly what I deserved. But as a result of that, you know, good decisions come from experience, but experience comes from bad decisions. And I have a lot of experience with bad decisions. And so as a result of that, I think that I can share a lot with you. Every podcast I see, at least in scanning YouTube, when I say every podcast of a similar nature, you know, commentary, advice, whatever, they always have an agenda. and they're always trying to sell something. Well, I shouldn't say always. Always is, there's probably thousands of channels I haven't seen. The big ones are always selling something. They always have an agenda. They always have a slant. They're always going one way or the other. I don't, because I have no political ambition, and because I don't, um, I want to actually help you, my goal in life is simple. I want to achieve redemption. But redemption for a Jewish guy, by the way, is not belief in Christ. I met plenty of guys in prison who believed that Christ forgave their sins. But as a Jew, I don't really have that. And I can't bring myself to believe that. I don't think Jesus would forgive me for what I did. I realize that my Christian brothers have told me a million times, yes, he would. But again, I think shame is a healthy thing. I think there's shame that can overwhelm you, and there's shame that can help you. And you've got to have shame. And if you don't have shame, and if you don't seek redemption, then you're not a human being. Or you're a sociopath or a psychopath. And I met plenty of those in prison. And I'll explain the difference in another podcast at another time. But I'll tell you what I do think. I think that reflection, when it turns into re-examination, it's healthy. I reflect on what I've done every single day, as I told you, of the year. 7 days a week, pretty much is my waking hours. It'll enter my thoughts all the time. When I'm driving my patients around, when I'm doing, just going about my daily business. A couple of hours ago, I was mopping the floor of my apartment, and it was going through my head while I was mopping. Whenever I do anything mindless, I love to fish. When I fish, I often think about it. But there's a difference between reflection and re-examination and regrets. I don't live with regret and re-examination, because to me, that's the gateway to mental illness. The minute you go down that rabbit hole of thinking, if I wouldn't have done this, and if I wouldn't have done that, and if I hadn't done this, you can do that once. That's reflection. But when you start doing it over and over and over, and playing it over and over and over in your head, and you're always going to come back to the same place, because you can't replay a game that's over. If I could go to each of the victims and explain to them on a one-on-one basis, which, by the way, I'm forbidden to do by law. I cannot contact the victims, and I think rightfully so. I think it would be too traumatic for them. It would certainly be traumatic for me. But I would be willing to do it if I ever run into them. If any of them, and I realize as I'm doing this podcast, it's almost inevitable that sooner or later one of them or more might see this and then share it with the rest, and then want to talk to me. And I'll tell you right now that at the end of my 5-year sentence, I had to do what's called a 7-year probation tail, which ends at the end of this year. At the end of that tail, when that's over, next year, I will be more than happy, those of you, just a side comment to any victims that see this, I will be happy to sit down with you, and you can ask me any questions you want, and I will answer them fully and completely. I'm not sure to your satisfaction, because I don't think anything that I've done could ever bring anyone satisfaction. But if you just need to hear it, and you need to look into my eyes, I'd be happy to do it as part of seeking redemption. Redemption is what it's all about. And if I can help people, if I can impart some of the wisdom that I've gained, and I do consider myself wise at this point. I wouldn't have called myself wise before prison. I would have called myself really smart. I'm very, very smart. Again, I don't believe in false modesty. That's another thing. Want me to pretend that I'm stupid? Okay, I'll pretend I'm stupid and be falsely modest. But actually, stupid's the right. Forgive me again. That was real. There's a big gap between very, very smart and stupid where the average live. And I wish that I had been born a little less clever. Let me use that word. Because clever, in absence of morality, is slick. And slick is a dangerous thing. And I was slick. I was smooth. I was charismatic. I'm a great public speaker. Why did people give me all that money to lose in the first place? How did people believe my bullshit story? And the answer is simple. I'm charismatic, and I have an ability to enroll people in my vision. Now, there's a reason that I have that ability. And I've had that ability since I was a little boy. And there's a reason for it. But I'm not going to discuss it today. That's for the next episode, when I talk about background and how I turned out to be the broken, that's the wrong word. I often describe myself as a dented can. I think we're all, in a way, a dented can. We have dents in different places. My dents, unfortunately, led to carnage in the lives of people that I, in many cases, loved and still love. And at the very least, were good friends of mine. And I'm sure, although I've spoken to none of them, I'm sure that they hate me. I got a dose of it in court when I was pleading guilty, and I got to hear what a few of them had to say, and it was pretty ugly. And some of what they had to say was just not true. Some of the accusations they made weren't true. They were absolutely convinced that I had millions stashed away in some account somewhere offshore, waiting to use after I got out of prison. And I've been out of prison now for almost 7 years, and I'm driving a 2019 Subaru Crosstrek, and happy to do it, by the way. Terrific car. And I haven't bought a new pair of clothes since I got out of prison in 2019. And those clothes were bought for me by my kids. There was no hidden cache of money. But I really, really understand why they felt that way. I really understand why they believed it. You can believe things that may not seem to be, the big clue that I didn't have it was I didn't have a lawyer. I had a court-appointed lawyer who was awful. Okay, and just beyond awful. She was clueless. And again, I would share that to you, but I don't care. The fact of the matter was, at that moment, I don't know if you've ever been in a position like this. Prison for me was a relief. I was under so much pressure, and I had dug myself into such a deep hole that by the time I went to prison, it was the first time in years I had slept through the night. There's a movie, and I'm not, this is a slight digression, but just to explain how I felt. There's a movie called Four Weddings and a Funeral. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but if you have, and if you haven't, by the way, Hugh Grant, Andie MacDowell, terrific movie, strongly recommended. Terrific. It's kind of a chick flick, but it's a great chick flick, and you'll enjoy it. Anyway, in that movie, at the end of the movie, Andie MacDowell shows up at Hugh Grant's door, and it's England, and so it's pouring rain. And she's just drenched. She's drenched to the bone. She couldn't be any wetter. And Hugh Grant says to her, "Why don't you come inside? And then we can talk." And he says, and I'm not going to share the plot. This is just in this one scene. And she says, "There comes a point when you're just so wet, you can't be any wetter. We can talk right here." And that's where I was after I pled guilty. I was so hated and so reviled. And I was actually a big fish in a small pond. I lived in Tucson, Arizona. I had a local newspaper financial column that I had for years. I had hosted a financial talk show of 150 episodes. I wrote a business bestseller in 1999 called How to Get Filthy Stinking Rich and Still Have Time for Great Sex, which is still available on Amazon. I am not encouraging you to buy it because I promise you it is toilet reading, although it does have I did predict the .com crash right on the nose, as I had already predicted it in the Tucson Citizen, which is now defunct. But I did a lot of television, CNBC, Fox, MSNBC, ABC, and CBS, again, a financial talking head. And, I had really been very successful, and so I was a big fish in a small pond. So when I went down, the local TV stations were there. It was a big deal. It won't be hard to Google me up and find out stuff about me. And it'll all be negative, it'll all be terrible, and there will be lots of truth in it. And some of it will be exaggeration because that's what the press does. But you know what? When you're a lowlife and you've done a terrible thing, you don't have any room to complain when people get a little carried away. You just have to understand it. And you have to understand that if you were in their shoes, you would probably feel the same way. And, whether they feel any different now, all these years later, I don't know. But I think it's up to them. That's what I think. But anyway, I treated prison, and this was conscious. Once I got past the entire process of being sentenced and going through processing and being sorted, and again, one day I'll share all this with you. This isn't going to be that day. When I got to prison and got settled in, and the first place I was in prison was in Yuma, Arizona, I decided to treat it like a monastery. Because that's to me what prison was. I was going to wear the same clothes every single day. I was going to eat the same bland diet every single day. I was going to have to follow rules that I could not negotiate or work around, given to me by people who were not necessarily my superior in any way other than in rank, but was going to have to do it absolutely positively out of, well, it was just mandatory. There was no choice. And I was going to have a lot of time in my hands. Prison is a giant men's homeless shelter. That's what it is. And we house these people for a period of time. We do absolutely nothing to rehabilitate them. We just pretend to. And then we turn them back out in the street to commit more crime. And they either stop by dying or typically reaching middle age when they're finally willing to work at a car wash when they wouldn't do it when they were 21. I'm being simplistic, but that's the way the system works now. Again, we'll go more into it as time goes on. But For me, I was very different. I was, first of all, intellectual, which made me pretty much the only one on the yard. So I read constantly, and I treated it as a monastery. I literally would read the entire library out. And in both Yuma and in Kingman later, where I became very good friends with the librarians because they would go out and find books for me to read because I was tearing through books. I used to read a book a day, sometimes 2 books a day. And in addition to writing 12 books, and when I say books, I'm talking about full-length novels. 11 of them are full-length fiction works and novels, and the 12th is a nonfiction work, which I will share with you in the next podcast. If you want to learn more about it, you can go to Amazon under my name, Herbie K. It's published there. It's called A Radical Reset. I'll talk more about that again in the next episode. This is just let's get to know each other. But if you do go to my Patreon link, and if you do go to my Buy Me a Copy, you'll get a free copy of the book. But I'm not going to pump it right now on what's in it, and what it's about, other than the title kind of says it all. But in treating it like a monastery, I had a lot of times on my hands, and I became much more self-aware. And between the guilt and the shame and the desire for redemption, and what I put my family through, and what I put my victims through, and what I did, my choice was either get on a path of redemption or die. It was how I looked at it. Every other guy I knew in prison couldn't wait to get back out. They call it on the street. That's just, that's a euphemism. But they wanted to get back on the street to do whatever it was that they did. I didn't want to get back on the street to do anything that I ever did. I was contacted after I got out by a lot of people that were not victims, but were friends of mine before, and they all wanted to get me back involved in business. And I told them, I just don't want to hear about it anymore. I don't want to be involved. I'll be happy to advise you. I get asked all the time because I was a really good investment guy. Really, that's how all these people became trusting me. I was really good at it. And and I'll still give financial advice. I just don't deal with any kind of investments whatsoever. I just tell them, here's what I would do if I were you, and you do it. And who should you do it with? Whoever you want. Over the course of this podcast, I'll give some advice, and I'll give some good advice. But what I won't do is ever ask you to invest in anything that I'm involved in. That party is over. That ship has sailed. I have no interest in that any longer. If I make enough money from this podcast to replace the roughly $2,000 to $3,000 I make a month driving, that would be a dream. Because my dream, frankly, is to buy an RV, downsize completely, and travel America for the rest of the good years of health that I have left, and then finally retire and enjoy I am kind of semi-retired, but enjoy my grandchildren. I just have a new grandson that was born a couple of days ago. I'm very excited. So I have 3 grandchildren. Hopefully I'll have a lot more, and that's what I hope to do after I adventure America or with them and bring them. Well, anyway, listen, I'm sure you're all parents and or grandparents and or budding or aspiring parents or whatever. This show isn't for boomers. This show isn't for Gen Z. This show is for anybody who, as Thoreau said, might live a life of quiet desperation. If you think that anything you're going through is particularly unique, if you think perhaps you've made a terrible mistake and you live in constant fear of it coming out, and you're looking for how do I extricate myself from this? If you're looking for, you're having marital problems, you're having business problems, you don't understand current events, you don't understand positions that people are taking, you don't know why this person likes this one and this one likes that. You hear all this stuff, you're deluged with this ocean, this waterfall of information that comes to us via the internet now, and with AI even more. And I love AI, by the way. I have a very positive view of AI. And my default setting, let me just digress here too a little bit. My default setting is optimistic, despite everything that I've been through. And I'll share more, like I said, in the next episode when it doesn't sound like an excuse when I talk about it. You might ask yourself, how is it that I can be optimistic? Save it for next time. I'll explain. But my default, it's why my default facial expression is a smile. It's not because I necessarily am happy about what I'm saying. It's funny. Guys used to ask me, in the track in Yuma prison, there was, and also in Kingman, but in Yuma, there was a formal track. There was an asphalt track that was 1/3 of a mile around. So 3 times around was a mile, obviously. So I would do 15 laps a day. I would do 5 miles a day. I would get up really, really early. The prison yard would open at 5:30 in the morning before it got real hot out there in the desert. And I would get up and go outside and do my 5 miles. And I would walk by myself, and the expression on my face, wasn't aware of it, but is this. This is my default expression. I'm kind of always smiling. And it's not a conscious thing. It's just a lifelong habit that I don't really care to break. I think it's nice to look at somebody who's not sneering at you. I get it. It's really worked for me over the years. But prisoners should say, what are you so fucking happy about, OG? By the way, when I went to prison, I thought OG stood for old guy, not original gangster, which I learned later. I do have a prison tattoo. Here, let me share that with you. I got my very own, there it is. This is it, my Star of David OG tattoo. Now by the way, those of you who are Jewish watching this know that tattoos are against the Jewish religion. If you're a religious Jew, but I am not, so I'm not worried about that. And secondly, I'm proud of my Jewishness, but I'm not particularly religious. And I did that, by the way, as a slap in the face to the Aryan brothers, because they were co-opting the Star of David, one of their crazy Nazi things, believe it or not. I can't even explain how. And they really were angry at me, and I told them to go have sex with themselves, basically. So anyway, I have lots of good stories like that. As a result, I'll share the details tomorrow, but I don't experience fear like other people. By the way, that's what led me to take horrible risks with other people's money. By the way, if you ever wonder, basically I was guilty of lying my ass off. And the only defense I would have, and it's not a defense, is that I believed my own bullshit. I was like George in Seinfeld. It's not a lie if you believe it. That's kind of the stupid rationale I was using in my head while I was telling. I would take a kernel of truth and I'd wrap it in bullshit and then use it to excite people, to basically intentionally stimulate their greed. And there's one thing that'll get people to invest money is if you press the greed button enough and you can make them trust you. And my whole thing was, there are all kinds of different people that sell things different ways. Some people sell with personality. Some people sell based on a script. I was always a knowledge salesman. I just made it my business to know everything there was to know about pretty much anything that was connected with anything that I was doing. And so I could be impressive, and you could mistake that for honesty when in fact it was just a reflection of my brain. But if there was a great book. It was called The Chosen. It is still in print. It is written by an author who's long since deceased. His name is Chaim Potok, P-O-T-O-K. It was made into a movie starring Robbie Benson, Rod Steiger, and Barry something or other, whose name I can't remember. But anyway, it was a great movie. But in that story, I won't go into the story, but there's a great lesson in that book, and the lesson is a great mind without a great heart is nothing. And I had a great mind, but I did not have a great heart. And I damaged a lot of people, both family and friends, that counted on me. And I will never forgive myself for it. And that's where I'm going to leave this episode today. This is just the basis on how I got to the bottom. Whether it's created wisdom in me, you'll have to judge that for yourself. But now you know I'm a criminal. I committed the crime I did. I deserved what I got. I served my time, and I learned something from it. And I hope I can teach you some of what I've learned from. And when I say I was the very top, I had an airplane. By the way, not a jet. It was a single-engine piston airplane. I've been a licensed pilot since I was 17. I learned to fly in the Navy. I went to the Navy early. Again, that's part of my story for next time. For this time, I'm going to leave it right there, just like I said. Thank you very much. Let me remind you again. What you already know. Click, share, like, blah, blah. Make this go viral. I love you so much. If I realize you're looking, my background is the window out my apartment. Maybe one day I'll be able to afford a great big set, but right now it's me doing it alone. If you find the editing clunky, it's because I'm doing it myself. If you find the camera work horrible, it's because I'm doing it myself. But I hope it's the content that's more important and not the camera work. That's all I've got to share with you for today. I want to thank you very, very much for joining me. I want to wish you all the best. God bless you all. God bless your families. God bless your children. May everything in your life go well. And if it doesn't, come back here and I'll teach you how to cope with it. Have a beautiful day. Bye-bye.